Yep.
Great. Okay. So we've had our share of technical problems, but it's going to be smooth sailing from here out. I'm confident of that. Kristen. So I'm really happy to be here today for this defense with Kristen. We've had just a really fun couple of years. Kristen joined the lab in 2021 and just hit the ground running. Let me just say a few words about Kristen's background. So Kristen received her bachelor's degree at Washington State University in physiological psychology. She went on to Pacific Lutheran, where she had received a master's of science in nursing, followed by a certificate as a nurse practitioner at UCLA. She has just an incredible clinical background and experience. She's worked in the college student health setting. She's worked in emergency medicine. And more recently, she has worked in bariatric surgery, in pre-post care, as well as a first assist during surgery. So she came with a really relevant and interesting background. Kristen is a PhD candidate in our translational biology, medicine and health. She already has several publications with several coming. She's done extensive presentation of parts of her dissertation work and has another abstract accepted to the American College of Sports Medicine meeting next month. I usually say that, this has two purposes, this defense. There's the sort of necessary part, which is the formal defense that Kristen has to pass. We're confident that's going to happen. But the most important part to me is that it's a celebration of the very hard work she's done, the culmination of this work today. So let Kristen get started. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Davey. That was very kind introduction. So thank you all for coming today to listen to me present on the culmination of my work here in the Human Integrative Physiology Lab with Dr. Davey and my lovely lab mates. We have looked into high levels of total energy expenditure across a spectrum of physical activity levels in the light of current models, and I'm excited to talk to you about that today. Sorry, the slides are reticent to advance here. So Healthy People 2030 includes increasing the portion of adults who do enough aerobic and muscle building exercise as a leading health indicator. And there's no dispute about the health benefits of physical activity. At the same time, we have limited understanding about how physical activity affects the energy budget and therefore energy balance. And so the overarching goal of my research has been to obtain a fuller understanding of that relationship. So first off, I'd like to go through some of the nomenclature just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I know you all have a background, so we'll be brief here. Total energy expenditure and the energy budget, we're talking about the same concept, and we'll use the term TEE quite a bit today. The basic components of the energy budget are physical activity energy expenditure, total energy expenditure is the total, and resting energy expenditure, or as we'll refer to it today as resting metabolic rate. And then 10% of the energy budget is committed to thermic effective food. Physical activity energy expenditure is the most variable, and it is a calculated variable, so be mindful of that. It is based on the measured data of total energy expenditure, measured resting metabolic rate, and the assumption of 10% thermic effective food. And so we get this equation right here, susceptible to all the errors related to total energy expenditure measurement, resting metabolic rate, and the assumption of thermic effective food. Physical activity energy expenditure is further broken down into exercise energy expenditure and non-exercise activity thermogenesis. which brings us to a few terms to also get clarity on. Physical activity versus exercise. Physical activity is any musculoskeletal movements, whether they're deliberate or not, regardless of intent, versus exercise really speaks to your intention, and it is deliberate movements for some purpose, usually for cardiovascular fitness, for competition, for training, etc. We'll use the word exercise pretty sparingly here because we're not really able to measure intent with accelerometry. So we'll focus more on physical activity. Sedentary behavior, just for clarity, the strictest definition of sedentary behavior is that the individual is in a seated or a reclined position with low levels of movement, more than resting metabolic rate, but less than 1.5 times resting metabolic rate. Our methods don't really speak to the position that the person is in, and so we will be looking at sedentary behavior strictly from the intensity perspective, but not the positional perspective. Finally, metabolic scope is a term that's synonymous with physical activity level. So you may read in the literature about PAL or physical activity level. These are really the same concept. The connotation with metabolic scope suggests it's more of a ceiling. So that's total energy expenditure divided by resting metabolic rate. And that's a metric that allows us to compare groups and compare individuals. So the reason that human energetics is such a important topic in these days is because it's a relatively new topic, because doubly labeled water technique is relatively new. It was introduced by Lifson and used in research with animals in 1955, and in 1982, Scholler applied this technique to humans. And after the initial boom, there's been somewhat of a flattening of the curve of the increase of the use of that technique due to costs of the isotopes and also costs of the analysis. But with advancements of that technology, it continues to grow as we're able to use lower doses to implement that technique and more advanced analysis techniques. We'll step through a brief history of the background that brings us to our discussion today, and we'll advance with that right now. So thanks to some of our early adopters, there's some background pieces of information that are really critical to what we do right now. Westerter et al. In 1986 studied 4 Tour de France athletes competing over 22 days. They measured doubly labeled water elimination at day 15 and at day 23, and found that their total energy expenditure expressed as metabolic scope peaked around day 15 and was sustained until day 23. There was a minimal amount of catabolic effect with a fat mass nadir on day 15 and a body mass nadir on day 23. But as you can see, the weight loss was surprisingly low, given that this was a 23-day event at 5 times metabolic rate on average. Another study by Westerter in 1992 was a much longer study. And so in this, researchers were looking at the effect of increased physical activity over the duration of 40 weeks in previously sedentary individuals as they trained for a half marathon. Individuals had fairly stable weight, really. Males had technically a significant weight loss, whereas females was technically not significant. It was about approximately 1 kilogram either way. There was a rise in total energy expenditure and a decrease in sleep metabolic rate. However, what's important to know in this study was that for the long term, the cap on total energy expenditure was 2.5 times sleep metabolic rate. And so the numbers from the last slide and this slide are 2 key numbers that have continued with us today. The long-term cap of 2.5 times BMR and the more short-term cap of 5 times BMR. This next study really demonstrates what happens when that metabolic scope is exceeded for a long period of time. This is a really interesting study. It was only 2 individuals. They embarked on an Antarctic trekking expedition in 1992. This was written up by Stroud et al. In 1997. They started at this ice shelf here on the Atlantic coast, and they trekked a total of 2,300 kilometers from the Atlantic coast to an elevation of 3,000 meters. So 3,000 meters for my fellow Americans translates to Camp Muir on the West Coast on Mount Rainier. So for my West Coast family and friends out there, that's Camp Muir. That's a huge ascent, considering that they were each pulling 222 kilogram on sledges, industrial strength sleds, carrying supposedly 100 days of food, which ended up not being 100 days of food because their energy expenditure was quite astronomical. Retrospectively, researchers calculated metabolic scope, and at day 50, metabolic scope was 6.9 times BMR. By day 95, they had lost 25% of their body weight, extreme loss of muscle mass, muscle strength, drops in testosterone and luteinizing hormone, and glucose levels that all I can say as a critical care nurse is that it's incompatible with life. Really astoundingly low levels and inappropriately high insulin levels. The doubly labeled water measurements at day 95 are likely to be somewhat spurious just because there was so much fluid shift from the massive edema from malnutrition that we would look at that 6.9 times BMR as the more accurate, not to mention the samples were lost for one of those participants. So the take-home point from this is kind of the consequences of extreme, prolonged physical activity, high levels of physical activity on a hypocaloric diet. Cooper et al. Conducted a review in 2011 of 20 studies. Remember, many of these studies were very small N, and so the culmination of these studies were reviewed with a total N of 171 individuals. Cooper stratified these studies into professional athletic training, athletic events, and military training. Among the professional athletes in training, metabolic scope was maintained at as high as 4.0 times basal metabolic rate without a catabolic effect. The reason being is these individuals had a constant adequate supply of easily digestible nutrients. Contrast that with military training, where a catabolic effect was seen at 2.7 to 3.3 times metabolic rate, relatively low in terms of these high numbers that we're speaking about. The difference with the military individuals is that they were rationed with their food. Some of their training also involved extremes of temperatures. The highest metabolic scope was observed at high altitude under cold temperatures. Unfortunately, in that study where metabolic scope was 4.0, they didn't have the data to determine if there was weight loss. I think you and I could all probably agree that there would have been. Hopefully we're seeing that thread by now. So this brings us to the models that we'll be really basing our research on now. Ponser in 2015 introduced the constrained model of energy expenditure, and in 2016, he presented research on population studies. So this example here shows a linear model of energy expenditure in which total energy expenditure increases in a linear manner relative to the increase in physical activity. The constrained model, however, would predict an increase in total energy expenditure up to a point at which compensatory mechanisms would occur and a plateau would be seen, expected to be about 2 times basal metabolic rate, at least in the long run. And so we see a curve that looks more like this drawn in the red line in that model. Ponser contends that this is an evolutionarily constrained or conserved model that is to defend body mass in the setting of scarcity in a physiologic process. And so this shows the theoretical cap here at 2.5 times basal metabolic rate. However, in Ponzer's exploration with the METS study, data from the METS study, which was 332 individuals with 5 different locations across the globe on 3 different continents. Individuals were physical activity was measured with accelerometry, and total energy expenditure was measured with the double E labeled water technique. Ponzer observed that physical activity, the curve of the physical activity energy expenditure did not cross the y-intercept at 0 as he expected that it should. In fact, it crossed the y-intercept at 600 calories. So there's a discrepancy. If an individual is not exercising, experiencing any physical activity, you would expect physical activity energy expenditure to also be 0. This was a problem for Ponzer. And so he explained the model in this way. The portion of physical activity energy expenditure under that 600 calorie y-intercept, he dubbed as activity energy expenditure 2. And the portion above it, activity energy expenditure 1, with the lower portion being the domain in which compensation would be occurring. We'll keep this domain here in mind as we move on to the next study. Somebody wants to come in. So this next study is by Thurber in 2019, and this study really shows us quite a lot of information. Thurber initially examined racers, six participants in the race across the USA. That race is exactly as it sounds. Participants started their race at Huntington Beach, and they raced on foot across the country all the way to Washington, D.C., running approximately 1 marathon per day for 6 days a week. So this is an amazing feat. And in fact, this is the longest study to date for endurance studies using the double E labeled water technique. What Thurber observed was that pre-race, participants' metabolic scope was 1.76, which is really consistent with population studies and not unexpected for habitual metabolic scope. By week 1, the metabolic scope had increased to 3.76 times basal metabolic rate. And then at week 20, it was back down to 2.81 times resting metabolic rate. At the same time, water turnover was relatively stable. So something happened here that caused a decrease in the resting metabolic rate. They continued to still run these daily marathons, so it wasn't their running that changed. So Thurber calculated the elevation cost in addition to standard formulas to calculate the running cost, and would dub that measure AEE1. And the difference between TEE, basal metabolic rate, thermic effective food, and the running cost would be dubbed as AEE2. Now, AEE2 cannot be explained away by improved running efficiency. That should explain about a 3% change, but not the dramatic change that was observed. So Thurber decided to examine the literature to determine what the relationship between event duration and metabolic scope is, and created a curve that looks something like this. This is not the actual curve, this is my rendition of the curve. And we see Thurber's data right here at about 140 days. And then this longest point that was placed on the curve is reflective of pregnancy and lactation as something of an endurance sport of its own. And then we look into this habitual zone, and this there's data for long-term population studies under habitual conditions in which metabolic scope has been reported to be consistently below 2.5, in fact, frequently below 2.0. So Thurber noted that even in studies where individuals were encouraged to increase their metabolic scope, that did not happen in any of the studies that they could find. It remained on this curve, and it remained on this curve whether it was under thermoneutral conditions or under cold or extreme heat conditions. It didn't change from the curve. And for that reason, Thurber contends that temperature is not the driver of metabolic scope. So Thurber proposed this concept of an alimentary limit, meaning that it is our GI tract that determines how long we can maintain and how high of a metabolic scope we can maintain. So researchers examined the literature again for overfeeding and endurance event studies, and somebody else wants to get in the room. Assuming that 1 kilogram in change in body mass would be the equivalent of 5 times basal metabolic rate, starting from that proposition, they calculated sustained energy intake and determined that across all studies, this was very consistent, that it was around 2.36 times that basal metabolic rate, independent of duration of those studies. And so this would suggest that no matter what folks did in terms of stressing their bodies, trying to overeat, or participating in endurance races, the maximum amount that people would eat was this amount right here, 2.36 times their basal metabolic rate. And that suggests that it's an alimentary limit that places the constraint on total energy expenditure. What that doesn't tell us is what the mechanism is. Where is the energetic trade-off coming from? And that's something that we would like to examine today as we move forward. The final study that I want to point out is actually from a review from an author by the name of Dolan, who provides a new iteration of the constrained model, which we will call the compensated model as we talk about that today. This is a little bit different variation, which says that at different points along the physical activity spectrum, the relationship between physical activity and total energy expenditure changes. In the lower ranges, individuals are limited by their cardiovascular fitness. In the mid-range, individuals experience compensation, and their total energy expenditure hits a plateau. But as they continue to increase their physical activity, total energy expenditure again will increase, but it'll increase at a rate less than expected by a linear model. And that is the lens that we want to look at our data between these two models, the constrained model and the compensated model. So in summary, sustained metabolic scope has been shown to be limited to 5 times basal metabolic rate. Beyond that, predictably, loss of body mass occurs. Elite athletes may sustain as high to 4 to 5 times basal metabolic rate as long as there's a constant supply of digestible energy. Maximum sustained habitual total energy expenditure is limited to 2.5 times basal metabolic rate. And sustained energy expenditure is a logarithmic function of event duration. And until number 4, until Thurber showed us this, the timeline, for example, in points 1 and 2 was a bit vague. Finally, maximum total energy expenditure may be primarily driven by the limits of the digestive tract, and means of compensation may be in part due to behavioral adaptations, such as limiting non-exercise physical activity, or as we will discuss, increasing sedentary behavior. And this brings us to the aims of our study. The first aim was to determine the relationship between physical activity and total energy expenditure, and this is key here, in weight-stable adults across the spectrum of physical activity under free living conditions using linear and nonlinear modeling. We hypothesized that this relationship would be best explained by a linear model. Furthermore, we aim to determine the relationship between other components of the energy budget, physical activity, energy expenditure, and resting metabolic rate. We anticipate that there will be no relationship between physical activity and resting metabolic rate, as other authors have seen in the literature. The relationship between physical activity and physical activity energy expenditure, we anticipate to be positive and linear as total energy expenditure, as a reflection of total energy expenditure. And finally, we aim to determine the relationship between physical activity and sedentary behavior, as well as select immune, reproductive, and metabolic biomarkers, and in turn, the relationship between those biomarkers and total energy expenditure, resting metabolic rate, and physical activity energy expenditure. For aim 3, we expect that there will be no consistent relationship between physical activity, immune, reproductive, and metabolic biomarkers. So moving forward to materials and methods. This slide is intended to show you a general sense of the design of the study. It was a cross-sectional design, so it was observational, and we examined 57 participants across a spectrum of habitual physical activity level at 2 points over 2 weeks. On day 1, we obtained weight, body composition, and resting metabolic rate. We repeated those on day 15. We obtained 1 set of fasting labs, as well as dosed with doubly labeled water. For the course of 2 weeks, we measured exercise or physical activity using accelerometry, obtained urine samples for analysis for isotope elimination, and obtained dietary records. On day 15, repeated measures were obtained as discussed, and we additionally measured maximum oxygen consumption using a VO2 max test. We screened 196 individuals to reach an N of 57. 69 of those met full criteria, 57 of them enrolled, and all who enrolled completed the full protocol. Thank you. We did the bulk of our data collection during the early part of 2022 on into spring of 2022, and with some additional participation later in the year and into early 2023. IRP was finalized in July 2021. We'll go through some of the variables and some of the methodological considerations related to those variables. Descriptive variables include anthropometric measures, body composition, and maximal oxygen consumption. The anthropometric measures were obtained on day 1 and 15. Height was obtained to the nearest ½ centimeter, body mass to the nearest 1 decimal place in kilograms using a clinical scale and stadiometer. We measured all these measures in triplicate and had participants dressed in pre-weighed laboratory supplied clothing to get a precise measure. For body composition, we used dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. We measured body composition again on day 1 and 15 using full body densitometry. These were all performed by either a clinical densitometrist or a certified densitometry technician. Measures included fat mass in kilograms, fat-free mass in kilograms, and percent fat mass, as well as bone mineral density. It was important that we showed stability in not only body mass, but body composition measures. We have height as a reference on this chart as a highly repeatable or highly reproducible measure. And body mass, as you'll see, and BMI, fat-free mass, and percent fat mass were all stable during the duration of the study. Additionally, resting metabolic rate showed excellent reproducibility. We measured maximal oxygen consumption as another descriptive variable using indirect calorimetry. We implemented a graded incline treadmill test to volitional exhaustion, and using validity criteria described by Van Pelt et al. Determined a test to be valid if Borg's scale for RPE was greater than 18. Maximal heart rate by Tanaka criteria was achieved. A respiratory exchange rate of 1.1 or greater was achieved, and a VO2 plateau was observed. Secondary secondary dependent variables included resting metabolic rate and circulating biomarkers. Resting metabolic rate was obtained with indirect calorimetry using a parvo-ventilated canopy and metabolic cart. Flow meter and gas calibration was obtained daily after 30 minutes of warm-up under a known relative humidity, temperature, and altitude. Participants were rested, no exercise for 12 hours. They were post-ingestive, only water for 12 hours, and they were awake during the duration of the study and were monitored throughout the study. Duration of the resting metabolic rate was 45 minutes, with the first 15 minutes discarded to ensure that steady state was achieved. Methodological considerations here. While we use best practices as described by Comfort for athletes, in which rest time is recommended to be 12 hours, for the general population, the rest period is generally 24 hours. For that reason, we wanted to make sure that there was not bias introduced by this, since we had non-athletes in our study as well. And so for the duration of time of 12 to 24 hours leading into the resting metabolic rate, we determined that there was no relationship between the time spent in moderately vigorous physical activity bouts and unadjusted resting metabolic rate adjusted for fat-free mass here in figure B. And we also regressed the moderately vigorous physical activity bouts on the residuals between predicted and actual using the Ponsor equation and using the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation, and found no relationships here. And so we're satisfied that, that this did not introduce bias into our data. We also obtained circulating biomarkers. As shown here, there's quite a number. We examined the whole spectrum of the differential and from the complete blood count. Primary independent and dependent variables. This is the crux of the study right here. Physical activity was measured using triaxial accelerometry, measured in vector magnitude counts per minute, which has been shown to have a superior relationship or correlation between physical activity energy expenditure measured by doubly labeled water compared to uniaxial. We used the Actigraph GT3X Plus, waist mounted, and it was worn during waking hours, excluding when showering, swimming, or otherwise submerged. Participants kept a wear time diary, and we used the Friedson 1998 intensity cutoffs, and that was important because we also used this metric to measure percent time spent sedentary. We considered a day to be valid if it contained 600 minutes or more, in keeping with criteria described by Wolf. And a valid week was considered for 4 valid days or more. On average, we had 13 valid days out of the 14, so that was really, really excellent adherence. Thank you very much, participants. Our primary dependent variable is total energy expenditure. We use the doubly labeled water isotope elimination technique, which is the gold standard for measuring total energy expenditure in a free living setting. We obtained baseline urine isotope enrichment and provided an oral dose of doubly labeled water, and 3 hours later, our first urine analysis. Following that, we obtained our second morning voids for 14 days. These were analyzed using the Los Gatos liquid isotope laser spectroscopy at the University of Aberdeen in the UK. So I want to go into a tiny bit of stoichiometry here for you, but not deeply, so don't worry. Hopefully that this is a familiar reaction to you. So this, what this indicates to us here is really what I want you to see is that the production of carbon dioxide and the production of water are proportional to metabolic rate. And we see here that oxygen is eliminated both as water and as carbon dioxide, whereas hydrogen is eliminated only as water. And the difference between these eliminations allows us to know what the change or elimination of carbon dioxide is. We need to know that because we're going to place that into the Weir equation to calculate total energy expenditure based on this value. Fortunately for us, stable isotopes of both hydrogen and oxygen can be safely ingested, and their abundance can be traced using mass spec or laser spectroscopy. Raising the abundance from baseline and serial analysis from body fluids allows the disappearance of these isotopes to be measured. We used the most current equation, which was described by Speakman in 2021. And this is how we calculated the RCO2 to be used in the Weir equation. This might look scary, but really, KO is oxygen flux, KD is deuterium flux, and it's basic multiplication here, so it's not as scary as it looks. So the next piece of the Weir equation that we require to calculate total energy expenditure is a value called RQ. So RQ is the respiratory quotient, and that is the ratio of the production of carbon dioxide to the consumption of oxygen. And it's a reflection of substrate utilization. For typical Western diet, an RQ is 0.85. However, we can measure this with more precision using the food quotient. And here is the equation that Elia described in 1991. Fortunately, we were able to receive expert training on dietary intake record techniques and implemented food intake records for 4 days and 24-hour dietary recalls for 3 days. We used the multiple pass method and entered our data into the Nutrition Data System for Research software. What we discovered was when we calculated total energy expenditure using an assumed RQ of 0.85 versus an FQ derived from dietary, the mean of all the dietary records versus food intake records versus recall, that there was a difference, a statistically significant difference using RQ and assumed RQ versus any of the dietary measures using repeated measures ANOVA and 2D post hoc analysis. So while the mean difference was not particularly clinically meaningful, our concern was due to variability in macronutrient intake that it could disproportionately affect the values for some participants versus others. So we stratified the diets according to NIH standards for low, medium, and low, moderate, and high carbohydrate intake, and found that in fact the percent carbohydrate diet did have a difference in the departure from expected RQ based on the assumed RQ from a standard American diet. This is particularly noticeable in the extremes in those in a very low carbohydrate diet, somewhat in the higher carbohydrate diet individuals as well. So for that reason, instead of using an assumed RQ in the Weir equation, we used the food quotient calculation for greater precision. This brings us to our results. What I want you to see from the sample characteristics is that males and females were nearly identical on most metrics, average age of 35, their physical activity, whether that was measured with accelerometry or their estimation of how many miles they run in a week. We expect to see differences in resting metabolic rate, total energy expenditure, and VO2 max, and most of that is owing to fat-free mass. Most of that disappears once you solve for fat-free mass. Metabolic scope, again, almost exactly the same, no significant difference between males and females, as was percent time spent sedentary. And here's the crux of the whole story right here. This is the relationship between physical activity, total energy expenditure as an absolute value, as an adjusted for fat-free value, adjusted for resting metabolic rate, or as expressed as metabolic scope, is most certainly a linear relationship. So this holds true however we adjust it, the R square really doesn't change. So it's a positive and linear relationship. And you will also see with resting metabolic rate, physical activity Whether it is unadjusted or adjusted, the relationship is near zero. For the sake of completeness, we also did our regressions, our linear, non-linear modeling with physical activity energy expenditure, and found essentially what one would expect, a positive and linear relationship, again, whether it's for fat-free mass or not. And then we regressed physical activity on percent time, and this is percent of wear time spent sedentary, and found a very strong positive linear relationship when we used accelerometry. We also found a positive linear relationship when we used the subjective measure of miles per week running or walking. So this suggests that individuals of higher physical activity are spending less time, less percent time sedentary, and this is in contrast to what the bulk of the literature has shown. I'll tell you a bit later why I think that is the case. With respect to inflammatory, reproductive, and metabolic markers, we examined an array of these markers and found a significant relationship in 4 of them once we had adjusted for appropriate body composition metrics and also for season. Given that we were looking at inflammatory markers, we thought it would be prudent to make sure that we weren't looking at an effective flu season or something. So we see a negative relationship between physical activity and absolute monocyte counts. We see a positive relationship between physical activity and C-reactive protein. And we see a negative relationship between physical activity and cortisol adjusted for season, and a negative relationship between physical activity and albumin adjusted for height. So given the array that I showed you of biomarkers that we examined, these were the only 4. So I would say the relationship is fairly consistent. We needed to take that one step further and determine if these relationships translated to a relationship between energy expenditure and any of these biomarkers. And there was only one amongst the whole spectrum. After adjustments, there was only one relationship that was positive and significant. Both of those negative, total energy expenditure and albumin adjusted for height, which translated clearly to physical activity energy expenditure as well, as one would expect. So what did we find? The relationship between physical activity and total energy expenditure in weight-stable individuals across the spectrum of physical activity is positive, linear, and unaffected by adjusting for fat-free mass or resting metabolic rate, or when expressed as metabolic scope. As there was no detectable relationship between physical activity and resting metabolic rate, the relationship between physical activity and physical activity energy expenditure was also positive and linear and unaffected by fat-free mass. The relationship between physical activity and percent sedentary physical activity was negative and probably linear. I will say there was a relatively similar chance of a slight non-linearity in that relationship. Even so, the curves were pretty close to normal. The AIC were not significantly different. Finally, though inconsistent, there was a general trend of a negative relationship between physical activity and circulating markers of inflammation. However, we found no consistent relationships between physical activity, total energy expenditure, or resting metabolic rate and these biomarkers. Together, these findings support a conventional linear model of total energy expenditure with no evidence of behavioral or physiological compensation in this weight-stable sample. Strengths of our study were our objective measures. Many of the studies that you will review in the literature contain doubly labeled water measured total energy expenditure, resting metabolic rate measured by indirect calorimetry, or physical activity measured by accelerometry. Very often you do not see all 3. We used all 3. We had a comparatively large sample size. I know 57 doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about doubly labeled water studies, 57 is actually quite a large sample size. Our participants were weight stable, and if there's anything I could emphasize, that is the important piece of the equation. In the setting of weight stability, it's expected that you will see this linear relationship. The range of physical activity levels is unprecedented in these doubly labeled water studies, and so that's something that was a really great strength of our study. In terms of limitations, I have to state the obvious. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Correlation does not equal causation. There's usually someone in the front row ready to raise their hand and announce that. And I don't know what that word is right there. Examine, I guess. So no inferences can be drawn. We do need to do a controlled clinical trial. There may be some underpowered differences that we were not able to detect. For example, age. There may be an effective age, but we're not powered to make that determination. There may be some limitation due to the range of physical activity in the sense that in Ponzer's 2016 study, in the general human populations that he examined, the change point occurred at a fairly low physical activity level in comparison to the range that we examined in our study. So we didn't have a strong showing in that range. So theoretically, there could be a change point in our data if it were extended further out in the lower range. Having said that, you can see that that it'd be highly unlikely for the slope to end up at a zero, at a zero slope, even if there was a change point. Accelerometry certainly introduced some limitations. And when we think about the physical activity energy expenditure curve crossing the y-axis at a non-zero point, it's hard to imagine that at least some of that would not be due to just error of the measures. For example, using the unadjusted data, hours crossed the y-axis at 176. And that certainly is within what one might reasonably expect the error to be from accelerometry. So future topics, Leah, for a randomized control. Sorry, Leah. Leah's fantastic. It's going to be great to hear from her here in the future. So randomized control trials are needed. I think there's a lot of interesting areas that we could delve into: age, fat-free mass, cardiovascular capacity, VO2 max measures, goodness sake, even, muscle biopsies, if anybody knows someone who does that. Thermoregulation, extremes of temperature and heat dissipation. So while Thurber did not consider that to be the overriding consideration for constraint, we could use some more high quality studies in that. Hydration, looking at osmolality, water turnover, ingestion, and then of course energy availability, and that could be in the form of energy intake, adiposity, or alimentary limitations. I would like to thank everybody, especially I would like to thank everybody today for all their technological help. The entire human integrative physiology, past, present, and up and coming. I owe a lot of thanks to University of Aberdeen and Shenzhen Institute of Advanced Technology, my entire committee, and especially my family, Paul Howard. I swear I'm never going to do this to you again. And then I didn't put Molly Parker on here, but many thanks, Molly. We pulled it off in large part because of you. So with that, enjoy a moment of levity before you consider all the questions you're going to throw at me.
So we'll have